It was one of those particularly cheerless mornings in late October when the soot of London seemed to hang lower in the air, wrapping the streets in a shroud of melancholy. A persistent drizzle had begun some time before dawn, and the sky bore the color of old pewter, promising no reprieve from its dreariness. Even the omnipresent clatter of hooves on cobblestones seemed subdued, muffled by fog and filth alike. Chapter 01. I returned to 2-1 Baker Street, soaked through the shoulders and half regretting my decision to take an early stroll. My cane tapped against the floorboards with a sharper rhythm than usual a consequence. No doubt of the dull throb behind my knee that had dogged me since the turn of the season. I pushed open the door with my free hand and stepped inside, grateful for the scent of burnt coal and the familiar warmth of Holmes' disordered domain. He was precisely where I had left him 2 hours before, sunk into the deep curve of his armchair by the fireplace, his sharp profile silhouetted against the orange glow. A haze of blue-gray smoke curled lazily from his pipe, trailing upward like a ribbon toward the cracked ceiling. His eyes, half closed, rested not on the crackling fire, but somewhere far beyond it, locked in that curious inner world he so frequently inhabited, where deductions bloomed like frost on glass. "Watson," he murmured without turning. "You've been to the post office, where you exchanged a few polite words with the clerk, Mr. Crimshaw, judging by the faint scent of pipe tobacco. On your coat and afterward walked through Regent's Park, where you stood too long by the pond, likely lost in reflection. Your limps worsened. The damp must be affecting the old wound." I stopped mid-stride and stared at him. "Holmes, honestly, do you take some demonic pleasure in being uncanny?" He gave a small smile, still without moving. "It's not demonic, intellectual." I shook the rain from my coat and placed my walking stick by the door. "And how, pray, did you arrive at all that?" He finally turned to face me, his pale eyes glittering with restrained amusement. "Your boots, my dear Watson, are caked with a specific reddish mud only found near the southern edge of Regent's Park. As for the pipe tobacco, it is Crimshaw's signature blend, cheap, oily, with a note of cinnamon. Tia, no one else in London seems mad enough to smoke it, okay? And you're pressing more weight onto your right side, which you only do when the weather causes your leg to act up." I sighed, both exasperated and impressed. "One of these days, Holmes, I shall invent a case, out of sheer boredom, and see if you can solve it backwards." Holmes let out a soft chuckle and returned his gaze to the fire. "You need not bother, Watson. The world is quite adept at providing me with puzzles of its own accord." As if summoned by prophecy, a firm knock came at the door downstairs. Mrs. Hudson's voice, half distracted but never inattentive, called up a visitor from Mr. Holmes. "Sir, says it's a matter of some urgency." Holmes' eyes sharpened immediately. He sat forward, pipe lowered but still smoking, and cast a glance at the clock on the mantelpiece. "Just on time," he murmured cryptically. "Show them up, Mrs. Hudson." A moment later, the door to our sitting room creaked open, and in stepped a man who seemed barely able to contain himself within the shape of his own clothes. He was tall, lean to the point of gauntness, with a face that had once been handsome before stress and sleepless nights had hollowed it. His dark hair was slicked back, but undone by the damp, and his gloves, still clutched in one hand, were soaked through. He looked around the room nervously before settling on Holmes with the air of a drowning man spotting a ship. "You must be Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said. "I must," Holmes replied, rising to his feet and extending a hand. "And you are?" "Michael Oswald, Lord Oswald's younger son." "Yes. You may have heard of my father, the Viscount of Pendlemere." I exchanged a glance with Holmes. That name was not unfamiliar. The Oswald family had long been fixtures in the political circles of Westminster, known as much for their estate in Shropshire as for their well-guarded secrets. "Please, sit," Holmes said. "You've come about a matter you find unsettling. Unsettling. Mr. Oswald laughed without humor. It's a damned riddle, Mr. Holmes, and the price of failing to solve it may very well be someone's life. That piqued my attention. Holmes gestured to the chair opposite the hearth, where Mr. Oswald sat heavily and began to wring his gloves between his fingers. He paused for a moment, as though gathering nerve, then began. It concerns my brother, Edmund, the heir. He's been missing for 2 days, now vanished from his chambers at Pendlemere House without so much as a word. We've searched the estate, the staff quarters, even the nearby woods. Nothing. Gone willingly or unwillingly? Holmes asked, voice flat. That's just it, we don't know. His bed was unmade, his walking coat missing, but all his money and personal effects were untouched. No note, no witness. Sound, which never leaves his side, was found in the stables, agitated but unharmed. Curious, Holmes muttered. What's more, Oswald added, lowering his voice, the room was locked from the inside. The only key was found in the drawer of his nightstand. No windows open, no disturbance. Classic locked room mystery. My pulse quickened. Holmes' eyes lit with quiet interest. And there has been no ransom demand. None. At least, not yet. And what was his temperament of late? Holmes asked. Any signs of melancholy? Altered behavior? Usual correspondence? Oswald hesitated. Edmund was withdrawn lately. He'd taken to frequenting his library late at night, scribbling in notebooks, burning letters. He'd grown secretive, even paranoid. He told me once that someone was watching him, but wouldn't say who. Okay? Silence settled over the room. Holmes stared into the fire for several long seconds before turning back to Oswald. I will take your case, he said, but I must begin at once. I want access to your brother's chamber, his belongings, and the library. No restrictions. You shall have them, Oswald said, standing. My carriage waits outside. Holmes turned to me. Watson, would you be so good as to pack a bag? We leave for Pendlemere within the hour. As I rose to do so, I felt a familiar thrill begin to stir, one I hadn't felt in some time. A mystery that made no sense. A vanished heir, a locked room, a brother who burned letters in the night. The fog beyond our window was thick, but within me, things were beginning to sharpen. Holmes' eyes glinted. At last, Watson. Something worthy of our brains. Carriage ride from Baker Street to the Oswald family estate in Shropshire consumed the better part of the day. It was a grim voyage through damp fields and gnarled woods, the autumn foliage withering on the vine as if drained of vitality. A fine mist clung to the window panes, distorting the shapes of distant trees into grotesque silhouettes. Holmes, as was his custom, remained largely silent throughout the sept, to make cryptic notations in a pocketbook and mutter the occasional deduction beneath his breath, none of which I could make out clearly. Lord Michael Oswald rode opposite us, seemingly lost in the rhythm of the wheels, though I noted a nervous tick in his left hand that never quite stilled. He stared at the floor, speaking only when addressed, as though fearful that his thoughts might betray something he hadn't meant to reveal. Holmes, ever observant, said nothing to disturb him. He merely watched. We arrived at Pendlemere House shortly before dusk. The estate loomed above the fog, like a relic of some forgotten, centurious sprawling manor of gray stone, its narrow windows glowing faintly behind layers of condensation. Ivy clung to the outer walls like a slow-growing parasite, and the grounds were in a state of slight neglect, as though time had grown weary of caring for them. We were received in silence by a footman. His face could have been carved from stone. Holmes stepped from the carriage before either of us, adjusting his coat collar with mechanical efficiency. He paused on the stone steps and tilted his head, listening. Quiet, he said softly, unnaturally so. Servants have been instructed to speak only when necessary, Oswald explained as he led us inside. My father insists on discretion. Discretion, or concealment, could not help but wonder. The entrance hall was vast and dimly lit, with high vaulted ceilings and ancient oil portraits glaring down from above. The place smelled faintly of burnt wood, rosewater, and age. An air of tension lingered, as if the very walls knew something they dared not say aloud. We were led first to the drawing room, where a fire had been lit, but could not quite chase away the chill in the corners. There we met Lord Cedric Oswald, the Viscount himself, seated like a judge in a leather-backed chair beneath a hunting tapestry. He was a man in his 60s, his once proud frame now shrunken by arthritis and discontent. His eyes were flinty, his voice unbending. I trust my son has conveyed the situation to you, Mr. Holmes, he asked without standing. He has given me the outline, Holmes replied, but outlines are often deceptive in their simplicity. I will need to see the room where your elder son was last seen and his personal effects. I would also request interviews with every member of the household staff, privately. The Viscount scowled. This is not Scotland Yard. You are here at my indulgence, not by warrant. Holmes smiled faintly, but it did not reach his eyes. And I shall conduct myself accordingly, Lord Oswald. My concern is not with jurisdiction, but with truth. The Viscount said nothing further, only waved his hand dismissively, and a servant escorted us upstairs as we ascended the grand staircase. I noticed Holmes' gaze darting along the banisters, the frames, the faint impressions in the carpet. He was assembling a picture long before we reached the scene. Edmund Oswald's chamber was on the 3rd floor, in the east wing. The hallway leading to it was lined with tall windows, each fogged over from within. The room itself was locked when we arrived, but the servant produced a small brass key, evidently the one found in the drawer. Holmes examined it carefully before unlocking the door inside. The chamber was both elegant and disordered to a curious mixture. The bed had not been slept in, but was half turned down. A walking coat had been removed from the hook by the door, but other outer garments remained untouched. On the writing desk lay several sheets of parchment, one of them torn in half and crumpled. Holmes picked it up carefully. No seal, he murmured, but the ink is recent, still moist near the fold. Someone attempted to write something, and then thought better of it. He turned to the window and examined the latch, locked from the inside, and no signs of tampering. You think he didn't escape that way? I asked. I think, Holmes replied, that it would have been an impossibility. The drop is too steep, the ivy too sparse to bear weight. And yet, he is not here. Ouched suddenly near the foot of the bed and ran a finger along the floorboards. Then he looked up, his expression unreadable. There's something off. What is it? Asked, stepping closer. Notice the dust pattern here. He gestured to the floor. A chair once stood near the window, and quite recently too, yet it has been removed. I looked down and saw the outline of square, of slightly cleaner wood, surrounded by the dulled surface of accumulated dust. Holmes scanned the rest of the room, his eyes narrowing. A man cannot vanish into nothing. He either left by means not apparent or he never left at all. Before I could reply, the servant cleared his throat. Mr. Holmes, you requested to see the library as well. Holmes rose. Yes, now, if you please. We followed the man down a separate corridor and into a wing that smelled of polished oak and old knowledge. The library was a cathedral of book-stowering shelves, of worn leather volumes, ancient maps, and faded globes. A pair of decanters stood untouched on a sideboard near a green velvet chair. A fire smoldered low in the hearth, barely alive. Your brother spent time here late at night, didn't he? Holmes asked Oswald. Yes. Oswald said. Every evening this past month, sometimes into the morning. Holmes circled the room, running his hands across spines and study tables, occasionally lifting a paper or inspecting a margin. At last, he paused at a shelf just above eye level. A cluster of books had been returned out of alignment, barely perceptible to a casual observer, but obvious to Holmes. He pulled one out. It was The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 4. Hollowed within was a small recess. Neatly folded was a piece of tracing paper with an elaborate geometric sketch, a series of interlocking triangles and circles, surrounded by nonsensical symbols. Holmes did not speak for some time. "What do you make of it?" finally asked. "A cipher, perhaps, or a map, but not one of terrain, one of thought. A man buries such things only when he fears them discovered." He returned the book and made another note in his journal. Then he turned to Oswald. "Has your family received any unusual correspondence lately? Any visitors unknown to the staff?" "None that I know of." Holmes stared into the fire. "Then it is not what has come in that matters, but what has been kept out." He turned abruptly. "I wish to speak to the staff now, beginning with the footman who tends the east wing and the maid assigned to this floor, privately and in their own words." As he swept from the room, I followed still, unsure whether we had gained anything concrete or merely layers of questions. But Holmes' manner had changed. His energy had quickened. He had seen something. I was sure of it. And if history had taught me anything, it was this: when Sherlock Holmes began to move with purpose, the truth, however strange, was never far behind. Zepster, 02. The interviews began at twilight. Holmes arranged for the drawing room to be cleared, save for a small table, 2 chairs, and a single oil lamp that cast more shadows than light. He believed darkness encouraged honesty, or at least made the nervous easier to read. I sat just out of view, observing in silence as the household staff was summoned one by one. First came the footman, thick-shouldered fellow named Trelawney, whose expression was carved in habitual deference. He stood stiffly before Holmes, hat clutched in both hands. "You tend the east wing?" Holmes asked, lacing his fingers together. "I do, sir, since the spring." "You clean and attend to Master Edmund's rooms?" "Yes, sir, morning and evening." He preferred I not enter when he was present. "Did you see or hear anything unusual the night he vanished?" Trelawney hesitated. "Not unusual, sir, but ... odd, perhaps. Around midnight, I heard voices. Assumed it was Master Edmund speaking to himself again. He's done that often of late." "From inside the room?" "No, sir. It's a library, I think." His voice carried. I passed that corridor and heard, well, a tone, like he was speaking low and fast, arguing, maybe. But when I turned back to look, there was no one there. It's just him, alone. Holmes cocked his head. "And what did he do when he saw you?" "He didn't. He never looked up. Just kept scribbling on some parchment, muttering." Holmes made a faint notation in his book. "Did anyone else enter the east wing that evening?" "No one but me, sir." "Very good. Thank you, Trelawney." Next came a young maid named Elsie Wickham, nervous, wide-eyed, and clearly frightened to be the subject of Holmes' scrutiny. She twisted the hem of her apron until it looked ready to tear. "You served on the 3rd floor?" Holmes asked gently. "Yes, sir." "Did you notice anything unusual in Master Edmund's habits before his disappearance?" She glanced around the room as if searching for an escape. "He was ... different these last few weeks. He didn't eat with the family, slept odd hours. Once I found a dead bird on his windowsill. He claimed it had flown into the glass, but I saw no broken pane." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "A dead bird, and he disposed of it himself?" "Yes, sir. Wouldn't let me near it. Said it was a sign." "A sign of what?" He wouldn't say. Holmes steepled his fingers. Did you hear anything that night? She nodded, slowly. I thought I heard a carriage wheel on the gravel after midnight. Just one pass, then nothing. I looked out my window, but the fog was thick. Couldn't see a thing. He dismissed her kindly. That would be all, Miss Whitcomb. When she had gone, Holmes sat back and stared into the flame of the lamp, his mind clearly racing ahead. I leaned toward him. Well, anything of note? Holmes didn't reply directly. 2 observations. Watson. First, Edmund was clearly unraveling, yet not in a wholly irrational way. He was purposeful in his secrecy, specious planning, not madness. Second, there's the implication of an outside influencer figure who has not yet shown themselves in this household, but whose shadow looms quite heavily over the details. I nodded, though I wasn't yet sure where that left. U.S. After a light supper, eaten in strained silence, with Lord Michael we retired once more to the library. Holmes began a second sweep of the room, this time examining the fireplace and the narrow crevices between shelves. I trailed behind, uncertain what he sought. Do you believe Edmund is dead? I asked, eventually. Holmes paused before answering. No, at least, not yet. If this were murder, why the secrecy? Why vanish entirely? A killer leaves a mark, even when trying not to. In the locked room means nothing in isolation. A locked door is as easily arranged as a broken window. He moved suddenly to the far corner of the room, where the floor met a line of small brass vents. What's this? He murmured. He crouched, removed a handkerchief, and retrieved something small, wedged into the vent, grating. It was a matchstick, burnt nearly down to the tip, yet curiously wrapped at the base with a thin strand of blue thread. Holmes examined it under the lamplight. This was used recently. Its carbon is still flaky. And this, he held up the thread, is not from any fabric in this house? He turned to me. Do you recall the scent in the drawing room when we first arrived? I blinked. Rosewater, old coal, ... age. Exactly. Yeah, here, he said, pointing to the vent. There is a different note, something sharper, an imported perfume, I believe. And this, he waved the match, is our second ghost. A woman? I asked. Holmes didn't confirm. Instead, he turned toward the far wall where an antique globe rested upon a narrow table. And now the geometry, he said softly. What geometry? He opened the hollowed book, again the one containing Edmund's geometric sketchhand, laid it beside the globe, with some rotation. The angles and shapes corresponded oddly well to the latitudinal lines on the globe's surface. Coordinates, Holmes whispered. For where? I haven't yet discerned that, but Edmund was chasing something. A location, possibly a belief. There was a knock at the door. A servant entered with a letter, hand-delivered and unmarked. Holmes opened it without hesitation and read it silently, his brow furrowed. Watson, this is becoming stranger than I imagined. Right? Is it? He handed me the note. It read, Curiosity is a key that opens to many doors. Leave Pendomere before the hour strikes 12. Some secrets do not belong to the living. There was no signature. Holmes rose. Well, he said, almost cheerfully. At least we're being noticed. Holmes, this is a threat. Indeed, and one timed that gives us opportunity. Tonight, Watson, we do not sleep, for I believe our adversary intends to make a move. Outside the window, the fog thickened like wool, and somewhere in the estate beyond, shutter slammed open, then closed. We remained in the library until well past midnight, Holmes prowling its perimeters like a wolf studying the boundaries of a cage. The warning note still rested on the desk, its ink dry, but its implications anything but. Holmes stared at it more than once, not with fear, but with a kind of disdain, as though its author had insulted his intellect by choosing melodrama over substance. Outside, the fog had thickened into a visible wall, sealing Pendlemere House in a damp silence. The only sound was the occasional creak of the wooden beams overhead, and the ticking of a long-neglected grandfather clock near the hearth. The hour hand hovered ominously near 12. "Do you believe the writer will return?" I asked at last, my voice barely above a whisper. "They never left," Holmes replied, eyes glinting in the dim light. "Someone within this house, not beyond it, delivered that note. The servants are loyal, but not incorruptible, and the family, while loyalty wears many masks. Watson." He crossed to the fireplace, knelt, and brushed away a thin coating of ash that had gathered near the iron grate. "More soot than heat," he murmured. "No fire's been fully lit in days, yet it was stoked when we arrived. For show, perhaps. Or perhaps to burn something. The missing correspondence," I offered. "Possibly. Or to erase footprints." I blinked. Footprints inside a fireplace. Holmes turned to me with that maddening half-smile. "Smoke reveals more than it hides. Imagine a thin layer of soot on cold stone. An intruder steps in, unaware. Then the fire is relit. The evidence is baked away, lest one knows how to look." He leaned in and used a metal poker to pry loose a blackened tile near the rear wall of the hearth. A small flake of something metallic tumbled out, thin, curved, and scorched. "What is that?" I asked. "A cufflink, gold-plated. The engraving is unfamiliar but ornate, not from a common set. Tanned, not Edmund's, from what I've observed of his wardrobe. Someone else was here, Watson, someone who left in haste." But he pocketed the item and stood. A fireplace tile clicked softly back into place. Then he turned and walked briskly to the window. His silhouette against the glass was severe, angular, the very picture of intense contemplation. "Let us suppose," he said, slowly, "that Edmund Oswald was not taken but fled. His writings suggest obsession, not fear. Obsession leads men to foolish decisions, okay? And what is more foolish than vanishing without a trace? Are you proposing he engineered his own disappearance?" Holmes tapped the glass with a single knuckle. "I am proposing that he believed himself to be on the brink of a revelation, something so significant, so personal, that he could not trust anyone else with it. And so he vanished deliberately, trusting that no one would follow the trail he left behind. But the locked room can be locked from within before leaving. Skeleton key, a narrow escape route. Okay, you saw the shelf behind his writing desk." I nodded. "There's a panel there, slightly bowed. I'd wager there's an access corridor, one forgotten even by the household." "But to what end?" I asked, frustrated. "To what purpose? K. Edmund may have been secretive, but he was no recluse. K. And he left behind everything. Money, notes, even his hound." Holmes did not answer at once. He moved to the desk and pulled out the notebook we'd seen earlier, the one with half-formed sentences and symbols. He flipped through its pages with surgical precision. "He wrote of mapping the echo," Holmes said, repeatedly. "Is that phrase, do you find it peculiar?" "Very," I admitted. "Poetic nonsense. Or encoded meaning. Echo suggests a duplication, a reflection, okay? And a map is meant for navigation. What if Edmund believed he had discovered hidden layer to the house, or rather, to the people within it? Cute, mean, metaphorically, possibly. But we must not exclude the literal, okay? This house has stood for centuries. It has known every sort of renovation, extension, and concealment. If Edmund believed there was something buried here, documents, relics, even memories, he might have staged his own disappearance to reach it undisturbed." At that moment, there was a faint knock at the library door. Holmes's hand went instantly to the inside of his coat, where he kept a small revolver, rarely drawn, but never far. The door opened. It was Lord Michael Oswald, disheveled and wide-eyed. "You're still awake," he said, stepping inside. "We expected company," Holmes replied calmly. You've not slept either. Either. How could I? Michael ran a hand through his hair. I keep thinking I'll wake and find Edmund in his bed, complaining about the draft and demanding brandy. Holmes gestured to a chair. Sit. I've formed an initial theory. One. Which? To test it. Michael looked intrigued, despite himself, and sat down. Holmes resumed pacing. Your brother believed himself to be under surveillance. He began hiding his notes, locking his doors, withdrawing from the family. That suggests paranoia. But what if he wasn't paranoid? What if he was being watched, just not by whom he feared? Michael frowned. What do you mean? Suppose? The surveillance was not external, but internal. Suppose someone close to him knew of his discoveries, his geometric sketches, his ciphered notes, and encouraged his delusions to discredit him. You mean ... a family member, possibly, who stands to gain from his absence? Michael hesitated. I don't know. Our father, perhaps. He and Edmund fought constantly. He disapproved of Edmund's academic diversions, as he called them. But that was all bluster. Yet you now inherit, Holmes said softly. Michael's head snapped up. You think? I think nothing yet, Holmes replied coolly. I only observe that motivation lies not in wealth alone, but in preservation. If Edmund had discovered something that threatened the family, the estate, the lineage, then anyone who values the Oswald name might take steps to silence him. Michael stood abruptly. This is absurd, is it? Holmes asked. Edmund's obsession was not madness. It was pointed. He believed something was hidden, and when he got close to it, too close, he vanished. Michael's jaw tightened. You're wrong. I'd never harm my brother. I only wanted him back, then help us find him, Holmes said. Tell me everything, every argument, every strange word he uttered, every guest you found suspicious. Michael hesitated. Then, with visible effort, he said again. There was a woman, he said at last. She came to the house 3 weeks ago. Said she was a researcher. Claimed to be studying ancient heraldry. Holmes' eyes sparked. What was her name? I don't know. She told Edmund in private. She never gave it to me, but she wore gloves constantly. It's blue silk. I remember that. And she smelled of something sharp like citrus and cloves. The same scent I detected in the library, Holmes said. That woman was no researcher. She was his confessor war, his handler. Nico looked up, confused. Handler. Holmes turned away, deep in thought. Someone who steered him, Watson. Who fed his curiosity and fueled his delusions. A guiding hand, masked as coincidence. But why? I asked. Holmes narrowed his eyes toward the window. Because sometimes, he said slowly, truth is more dangerous than lies. And Edmund Oswald may have been closer to uncovering one than anyone dared allow. Scepter, 03. It was nearly 3:00 in the morning when we finally retired from the library, though retired is perhaps too generous a term. Holmes remained a restless presence, even within his own chamber. I heard him pacing above mine for more than an hour, the rhythm occasionally punctuated by the sound of furniture being shifted or a drawer pulled open and shut. Sleep eluded me, though exhaustion pulled at my bones like lead. I found myself lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling beams, mind awash with theories and possibilities, none quite forming a complete picture, when I finally drifted off. It was to a half-dream in which Holmes and I were wandering an endless corridor lined with mirrors. Carry reflection showed a different version of ourselves, some familiar, others grotesque. In the dream, Holmes turned to speak, but his voice came out as the sound of a match being struck. I awoke just after dawn, startled by a firm rap at the door. When I opened it, Holmes stood fully dressed in his gray traveling coat, eyes alight with quiet purpose. Come, Watson, he said, without Preamble. The household is still asleep. You mustn't waste that advantage. I dressed quickly and followed him downstairs. The fog had begun to lift, replaced by a pale, mournful sunlight that bled through the high windows. The stillness was unsettling, not the peaceful kind, but the sort that preceded disruption. Holmes led me once more to Edmund's study, where, "Not here to look for what's missing," he said, "but for what remains." A man attempting to disappear often forgets that traces of his intent are etched into the mundane. The room was just as we had left it, though colder now. It was closed. The door behind us, and walked to the writing desk. He knelt, his time paying special attention to the small drawer we had previously ignored. "Note the scratches around the lock," he said, as though it had been forced open and not recently. Someone besides Edmund was interested in its contents. He produced a small folding knife and delicately pried the drawer loose. Inside, among spare paper and broken quills, lay a shallow dish ceramic with a blackened edge as well as a strip of fine muslin cloth, stained a deep rust brown. "Blood?" I asked instinctively. Holmes sniffed the cloth, then held it closer to the light. "No, iron oxide and tannin. This was used to blot ink perhaps recently, but look at this." He held up the dish. The inside bore a dark residue that shimmered faintly. "A chemical bath," Holmes said. "Used to reveal invisible ink. Basic potassium ferrocyanide mixture. It's very effective." Edmund was writing in cipher, Watson, but more than that, he was writing things not meant to be seen without intent. Holmes opened the desk's lower cabinet and withdrew one of the discarded letters we had noted earlier. He dipped the corner of the muslin in warm water from a jug by the window, then dabbed it across the paper. Lines began to emerge, jagged, sharp, like broken wires drawn across the page. Holmes smiled faintly. "There," he said. "Look." The hidden message read. The voice returns in the fifth echo. "Find the door beneath the oldest name." "What in blazes does that mean?" I asked. "It's a clue," Holmes murmured. "Or a riddle." The fifth echo. That's a curious phrase. Echoes imply repetition, possibly sound, possibly image, and the oldest name. He stood suddenly and strode to the bookcase. "There's no time to parse this linearly. If Edmund left this message, he meant it to be discovered later, not by accident, so we must think as he did not chronologically, but symbolically." Holmes began pulling books from the shelf, not at random, but with astonishing speed and precision. He set aside several volumes with titles pertaining to genealogy, heraldry, and early English settlement. Finally, he stopped at a thick, dust-caked tome bound in crumbling leather, the founding lineage of the Oswald house. He opened it and scanned the brittle pages until he stopped at a woodcut image of an austere man in doublet and chain. "Sir Reginald Oswald, the founder of Pendlemere House. There's your oldest name," Holmes said, "and beneath it, ... Yes." The portrait was mounted on thick backing, unlike the others in the book. Holmes ran his finger along the edge until it caught on a raised seam. With delicate care, he peeled the image free and revealed a sheet of parchment pressed flat beneath it. It bore the same ciphered pattern as the tracing paper. It found earlier geometric symbols, but now labeled with cryptic notations. At the bottom, a single phrase in block script, Echo 5, below the south stair. Holmes inhaled slowly. "That's it. It's a fifth echo. Not a sound, but a step. It's a staircase. Watts in the south wing. There's something beneath it." Wheat moved quickly. The household was just beginning to stir, but Holmes knew these halls now as well as any servant. He led us through a side corridor and down into a portion of the manor I had not yet seen narrow, sloped slightly, with older stonework and unpolished sconces. We reached the base of the south stair, like the grand central staircase. This one was tighter, more utilitarian. It curled upward to the servants' quarters, but at the base, just where the final step met the ground, Holmes knelt and began tapping against the paneled wall. "Here," he said. "Feel that? Hollow." With care, he pressed against a knot in the wood. There was a soft click, and a section of the panel slid aside, revealing a cramped passage descending into the dark. Holmes lit a lamp and turned to me. "Shall we?" Air grew colder as we descended, thick with the scent of damp earth and mildew. This passage twisted, narrowing until we could only move single file. At last, we emerged into a chamber no larger than a garden shed, its walls lined with crumbling brick. A table sat in the center, with papers scattered across it. A cat rested in the corner, and on the table neatly arranged were Edmund Oswald's personal effects. His journal, his family signet ring, his pipe. But no Edmund. Holmes approached the journal and opened it carefully. Inside were pages upon pages of observations, symbols, and philosophical musings, dozens of entries cataloging what Edmund called echoes and bloodlines, architectures of memory and waking illusions. "He's been hiding here," I said, "living down here, down here." "Yes," Holmes replied, "but not recently." He held up a candle stub and examined its wick. "Burned to the end 3 nights ago. No wax trail since." Turned the pages of the journal with solemn precision. Then he stopped. "Watson," I moved beside him and read over his shoulder. One entry was marked in red ink, surrounded by a hand-drawn circle. "She knows. I showed her the 5th echo. I trusted her. Now I must vanish from even the house itself." "She," I murmured. "The woman in blue gloves," Holmes said grimly. "She didn't guide him. She betrayed him." He straightened, pocketing the journal. "We're not alone in this hunt. She's searching too, okay? And if we do not find Edmund first, we may not find him at all." We emerged from the hidden chamber beneath the south stair with the weight of dread upon us. The revelation of Edmund's secret refuge, while illuminating, brought more questions than answers. He had hidden, yes, but now he was gone again, and someone had followed him into the shadows. Holmes walked ahead in silence, his brow drawn tight, as though holding back a thought too dangerous to voice. I trailed behind, glancing over my shoulder more than once, convinced that the very walls of Pendlemere were listening. Back in the main corridor, the house had fully stirred. Servants bustled discreetly about with downturned eyes, and Lord Cedric was pacing in the breakfast room, looking as if he had not slept in years rather than days. His face lit with a momentary hope when he saw us. "Well," he demanded, "is my son beneath this very roof or not?" "He was," Holmes replied coolly, "but no longer. What remains is a journal and a warning." Lord Cedric's eyes narrowed. "A warning." Holmes produced the journal and tapped its marked page. He feared betrayal from someone he trusted. The Viscount took the book, scanned it briefly, and handed it back with a scoff. "More ravings. My son always had a taste for melodrama. Melodrama is often the echo of suppressed truth," Holmes said. "Can you tell me about a woman who visited Edmund 3 weeks ago? Blue gloves, searcher's pretense." The Viscount's brow twitched ever so slightly. "You know of her?" Holmes said flatly. "Perhaps. There was a woman, yes. Tease. I don't recall her name. She presented papers, claiming she was with the Royal Heraldic Society." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "And you believed them?" "I did not inspect them closely," Cedric said dismissively. "My son had the right to entertain guests, even odd ones." "What did she look like?" "Dark hair, olive skin, educated voice. Foreign, perhaps, though her accent was polished. I assume she was one of Edmund's eccentric acquaintances from university." "She wasn't." Cedric lifted an eyebrow. "How do you know?" "'Cause she left no trail," Holmes said. "No registry, no servant recollection of her departure, no name on the guest log. It's as though she stepped in from the fog and vanished with it." Lord Cedric frowned, but said no more. As we stepped out into the hallway again, I turned. to Holmes. Why would Edmund trust her? He clearly knew he was in danger. Holmes' voice was low. Fear and fascination often wear the same mask. If she played to his obsessions, Seiko's hidden knowledge, ancestral secrets, then he might have believed her an ally. Until it was too late. We returned to the library to regroup. There Holmes spent nearly an hour laying out every known scrap of evidence. On the desk, he arranged the encoded map from the Book of Lineage, the burnt matchstick wrapped in thread, the warning note, the hollowed book, the dish used for invisible ink, and the now smeared journal entries from Edmund's desk. I watched him work, wondering how all these disparate items could ever align. But Holmes was not searching for a pattern. He was creating one. "Watson," he said suddenly, "what do you make of the phrase, the fifth echo?" I considered. It could refer to a step, as we saw, or a repeated pattern, or even a person, someone part of a family sequence. Precisely. Edmund saw echoes in people, not just in architecture. He believed the past repeated itself, genetically, spiritually, morally. He feared becoming his ancestor, I said slowly, or perhaps uncovering something that would make the family legacy ... monstrous. Holmes gave a grim nod. And that is the root of this case. Not disappearance, not madness. Legacy. There is something in this house. Truth buried so deep it needed generations of silence to keep it hidden. A knock interrupted us. This time, it was Elsie Whitcomb, the young maid. She held a scrap of paper in her trembling hands. "This was left in the East Wing laundry bin, sir," she whispered. "It's not from any of us." Holmes took it and unfolded it carefully. On it was a hastily scribbled message. "She returns at dusk. Do not stop her. She knows where the blood begins." Holmes' face went still. Then, to my astonishment, he smiled. "Watson," he said, "but she's making a mistake. She's coming back." I asked, stunned. "Indeed, and she thinks herself unseen. But her overconfidence will be her undoing." He turned sharply toward Elsie. "Did anyone see who left this?" She shook her head. "No, sir, but it's not one of ours." "The ink's different, smells like rose." "Of course it does," Holmes murmured. "Citrus and cloves to mask it." He turned to me. "Tonight, we set a trap. One she cannot resist." The plan was simple in structure, but complex in execution. We would allow word to circulate through whispers, staged remarks, and planted clues that Lord Cedric had hired additional men from London to search the estate, and that the library would be locked indefinitely after nightfall. This would pressure her. If she sought something Edmund had left behind, some final piece of the puzzles, she would have to act. Tonight, Holmes arranged for the servants to vacate the south wing entirely. Lord Cedric, perhaps sensing that Holmes was closer to resolution than he admitted, offered no resistance. Even Michael withdrew, reluctant but trusting. By nightfall, Holmes and I concealed ourselves in the darkened library, shutters drawn and lights dimmed to a flicker. The silence was total, broken only by the subtle pop of the hearth. "She will come for the cipher," Holmes whispered, "or for the journal, or for something else Edmund never meant to share. And she come alone." We waited in total silence. It was nearly midnight when we heard the faint click of the door. A figure moved in, gloved, cloaked, and almost spectral in the dim light. She closed the door quietly and moved straight for the desk, as though she had done so before. Her gloved hand reached for the journal. Holmes struck a match, and the room leaped into light. "Don't move," he said quietly. She froze. She was not older than 30, with sharply intelligent eyes and a face made unreadable by the flickering shadows. Her expression was not fear but annoyance. "You're not police," she said, her voice lightly accented. "No," Holmes replied. "I'm worse." She stared at him for a long moment, then sat slowly in the nearest chair, I assume. She said, "You've read the journal." "Every word," Holmes said, "and you will explain precisely what you are looking for." Before I let the Viscount decide how to prosecute trespassing and theft on ancestral grounds, she looked to me, then back to Holmes. "He trusted me, Edmund, more than he trusted his own family. And you betrayed him," I said coldly. She shook her head. "He was going too far. He had uncovered something terrible, something he should never have written down." Holmes leaned forward. "Then tell us what that something was." She hesitated. Then, very quietly, she said, "Edmund believed that one of the Oswald ancestors murdered his own brother and buried the truth beneath the south wing, centuries-old fratricide, covered up by generations. He believed he had found proof, documents, a confession sealed into the foundation. If he was right, the entire family line would be dishonored. So you came to stop him?" Holmes asked. "I came to protect him from himself. But someone else got to him first. Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Who?" The woman hesitated, then spoke a single name, and Holmes, for the first time in our long friendship, I looked genuinely shocked. "CHSPTER04. The name she uttered softly, deliberately hung in the air like the tolling of a chapel bell. "Lord Cedric Oswald." The words struck like thunder. For a long moment, neither Holmes nor I spoke. The woman, whom we still knew only by implication, met our stunned silence with calm resolve. The candlelight danced across her sharp cheekbones and narrowed eyes, but there was no malice in her expression, only weariness. A woman who had long feared the truth and now surrendered to it. Holmes was the first to move, his voice low and level. "You'll explain from the beginning. No omissions." She nodded. "My name is Lentine Varka. My father was a historian at King's College. I came to know Edmund through his lectures. He was a brilliant mind, hungry for mystery. We connected over ancestral archives. That's how it started. But that's not how it ended," Holmes said. She nodded gravely, began to share theories, ideas that frightened me. He believed there had been a crime covered up centuries ago, the murder of Sir Reginald's younger brother, Thomas Oswald, whose name had been wiped from all records. Edmund thought the family line had been built on that lie, and Cedric knew. I asked. "He suspected," she replied, "or perhaps feared Edmund would succeed in proving it. There were arguments between them, late-night shouting matches. I wasn't always there, but Edmund told me enough. The old man saw his son as a threat to Pendelmere's legacy, disgrace waiting to happen." Holmes had resumed pacing, hands clasped behind his back, his profile lit in amber shadow. "You said someone reached Edmund first," he murmured. "What did you mean by that?" "I mean he vanished before I could convince him to stop," she said. "The last time I saw him, he was preparing to retrieve the final piece of document he believed to be buried beneath the south stair. I told him it was dangerous. He smiled and said, 'Then I'll bury it deeper.' And then, he vanished. I've searched every night, looking for the trail only he could have left." Holmes stopped abruptly. "You believed Lord Cedric had a hand in it?" "I still do." There was no tremor in her voice. She spoke as one who had weighed the cost of every word before uttering it. Holmes considered this in silence for several seconds before reaching into his coat, kept, and pulling out the scorched cuff link he had recovered days earlier. "Does this look familiar?" She glanced at it and inhaled sharply. That was Lord Cedric's. I saw Edmund holding one just like it after a row between them. He was fuming, said he'd finally seen proof that Cedric had followed him into the hidden room, that someone had been in the fireplace. Holmes pocketed it without another word and turned to me. "Watson, bring Lord Cedric to the drawing room. We're done chasing shadows." I nodded and left at once, my mind reeling. I found Cedric near the study, half-dressed and irritated. "What is it now?" he snapped. "Holmes requires your presence." Now, something in my voice must have reached him, something darker than urgency. He followed me without protest. When we entered the drawing room, Lentine Farka stood quietly by the hearth, her gloved hands folded before her. Holmes faced away from us, his gaze fixed out the window, as if speaking to the fog. "Lord Cedric," Holmes said, "there's a truth buried beneath this house, and I believe you know precisely where it lies." Cedric stiffened. "I don't appreciate your insinuations. I'm beyond insinuation. I have evidence, circumstantial, yes, but damning nonetheless. Your cufflink found scorched behind the hearth tiles. Your refusal to comment on Leontine's presence. Your silence when questioned about Edma's last days." Cedric scoffed. "This is theater. You have nothing." Holmes turned slowly, every movement measured and cold. "Then allow me to tell you a story." He crossed to the fireplace and pulled the geometric cipher from his pocket. Edmund Oswald. Heir to Pendelmere begins tracing echoes both architectural and ancestral. He discovers an anomaly in the south wing, hidden rooms, encrypted notes, a forgotten murder. He tells someone, a woman who wishes to protect him, but someone else listens too. He locked eyes with Cedric, a man terrified of disgrace, a man who believes family is built on stone and silence. So, when Edmund begins digging, the man follows, confronts him, perhaps even strikes him. Whether in anger or panic is immaterial. Pedum is silenced, and the man hides it not well, not cleanly. He leaves behind ashes, threads, a cufflink, and he leaves behind a story too tidy to be true. Lord Cedric's face was unreadable. Then, slowly, he crossed to the liquor cabinet, poured himself a brandy, and drank deeply. "You assume too much, Mr. Holmes." "Do I?" Holmes asked, stepping closer. "Then prove me wrong. Show us what lies beneath the southern stare." Silence. Then a brittle smile crept across Cedric's face. "You think I buried him?" he said softly. "My own son." "I think you buried the truth," Holmes said. Cedric slammed the glass down. Edmund was going to destroy us, ruin everything the Oswald stood for. "So you silenced him?" I asked, shocked by my own boldness. "No," Cedric said. "Tried to stop him. That's all. Confronted him. Yes, but he was already mad, talking about echoes in blood and memory ghosts. He ran from me, not because I struck him, but because I wouldn't indulge him." Holmes tilted his head. "Where did he run?" Long pause. "To the catacombs," Cedric said at last. "Below, the south wing. Their seal now collapsed from time, but Edmund believed something remained." Holmes drew a breath. "Show us." It took nearly half an hour to reach the sealed passage beneath the southern wing, a portion of the estate neither I nor Holmes had fully explored. The air there was thick with mold and rot. Holmes examined the stone wall at the far end and nodded. "Collapsed," he muttered, "but not irreparably." Watson helped me. With effort, we pried loose a few bricks. Behind them, the air was colder, emptier. A tunnel waited. We pushed forward by lantern light. The path was narrow and uneven, lined with old ossuary shelves and remnants of a forgotten past, bones, clay vessels, iron tools. Then we found it. A small chamber carved from limestone. That's it. Stood a chest, wooden, ancient, bound with corroded iron. Holmes knelt, inspected the lid, and opened it slowly. Inside, parchments wrapped in oilcloth. On the topmost page, a seal bearing the Oswald crescent, a signature, Thomas Oswald. Holmes read the first few lines aloud. "Let this serve as my confession, hidden where no son of Reginald shall find it, save in shame. ... A silence fell over us. Lentine stepped forward, her voice barely audible. He was right. Edmund was right. Holmes closed the chest gently. And now we must decide what to do with the truth. The chest sat upon the stone slab like a coffin, unearthed from time itself. The brittle papers within it, stained and warped by age, bore witness to a history long buried yet not forgotten. Holmes leafed carefully through the contents as the flickering lantern threw wild shadows upon the poem walls. The torchlight revealed our grim expressions, but none more haunted than that of Lord Cedric Oswald, who leaned against the wall, silent, his gaze hollow. "What does it say?" I asked. Holmes did not look up. "It is a confession, written by Thomas Oswald, youngest brother of Reginald, and never mentioned in any public record." He paused, then read aloud. "I was cast out, not for crimes committed, but for truths uncovered. My brother feared my knowledge, my love, my lineage, learned that my birth was not pure, that I was begotten of scandal. Reginald's shame was not in my blood, but in his own cruelty. When I threatened to reveal his secrets to the church and the crown, he struck me down and sealed me away. I write now by lantern and tears, as death draws near." Holmes lowered the parchment. "Reginald Oswald murdered his brother," he said softly, "and built his legacy atop the silence." Lentine crossed herself. "So Edmund, he uncovered this." Holmes nodded. Bit by bit, the architectural inconsistencies, the sealed stairwells, the ciphered maps all led him here. But he vanished before he could bring it to light. Cedric stirred, finally, his voice hoarse. "Then why hide it again? Why not tell me?" Holmes turned toward him. "He feared you would destroy it, or him, never would have you followed him into the hidden study. You confronted him. I tried to talk sense into him. When that failed." Cedric looked away. "Rand?" Holmes stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "And you followed?" Cedric swallowed. "Yes, I followed him into the catacombs, but he was gone. I thought he would come back." Holmes studied him a moment longer, then turned to Lentine. "Did you know where Edmund had gone?" She shook her head. "Only that he intended to hide, to protect what he had discovered. He was afraid." Holmes turned back to the journal he had taken from Edmund's secret room. He flipped to a marked page and pointed to a single phrase. "If the truth cannot be told in life, let it wait in silence." "Watson," he said, "you recall the dish we found, the one used for invisible ink?" "Of course. It contained potassium ferrocyanide, common for revealing iron gall ink. But it reacts not only with written messages, it also reacts with blood." My brow furrowed. "But you're suggesting there's more to find." Holmes walked to the opposite wall of the catacomb, a low limestone surface worn with time. He took a clean cloth from his coat, soaked it with the remainder of water from our flask, and dabbed it across the stones. At first, nothing. Then letters began to emerge, faint, rusty red. "To my brother's inheritor, know this. He buried me in darkness. I bury him in shame." A long silence followed. Holmes straightened. "Edmund did not run, Watson. He hid. He believed that his survival would jeopardize the very truth he sought to protect. So he created the illusion of disappearance, knowing that any attempt to discredit the family from within would fail. Then he's still alive?" I asked. Holmes' gaze was inscrutable. "Possibly. I believe he left this house days ago, using the old servants' passage behind the eastern orchard. The maid mentioned a man in a cloak seen by the gamekeeper at dusk, heading south. No one questioned it was chalked up to weather illusions." He looked down again at the journal, but Edmund left behind one final note. He read aloud. "The echo leads not just to legacy, but to reckoning. If I vanish, let the words outlive the blood. Let the truth echo louder than the name." There was a moment of stillness, as though the house above were listening. Then he intended us to find all this, I said. Every clue. Holmes gave a faint smile. Naturally, he was many things, but not careless. Cedric had sunk into a stone bench at the side of the chamber, his expression fractured. What will you do with it? He asked Holmes. Question, Holmes replied coolly, is what you will do with it. Cedric said nothing. Holmes handed him the journal and the confession. You may burn these. No law compels you to admit the sins of your ancestors. The statute of time protects Reginald's crime from legal prosecution, but the choice is yours. You will leave that to me, Cedric asked bitterly. I solve crimes, Holmes replied. I do not mete out justice. Lentine looked at Holmes with a strange expression. You still haven't answered the real question. Holmes tilted his head, which is, why was Edmund so afraid? Why fake his own disappearance, if all he found was history? Holmes walked toward the chest once more, because Edmund believed wrongly or rightly that the Oswald curse was not metaphorical. He believed the family line carried not just legacy, but madness, mental illness. I asked. Perhaps, Holmes said. Or the weight of guilt passed from father to son, like blood through a vein. He paused. He feared becoming the next Reginald, or, worse, repeating the murder in reverse. And so, he vanished. I looked around the room, so full of history and tragedy, thick with unspoken things. What happens now? I asked quietly. Holmes extinguished his lantern. Now, he said, we let the echo and return to the surface as the sun rose, casting Pendelmere House in a light it had not known for generations. Lord Cedric retired to his study and did not emerge for hours. Lentini took her leave shortly after, her blue gloves folded away. Her mission complete. 2 days later, Holmes and I departed for London. As we stood by the rail platform, I finally turned to him. You let him go? I said. You let Edmund remain hidden. Holmes nodded once. Some disappearances are not crimes. They are choices, tastes, and sometimes justice is best served by silence. I said nothing more. We boarded the train, the whistle echoing like a cry through the valley. Behind us, Pendelmere faded into the morning. Mista, House of Echoes, now finally still. CSPO 05. It was some days after our return to London before I gathered the clarity to record the events at Pendelmere in my journal. Holmes, for his part, had already immersed himself in another castle matter involving forged Italian manuscripts and a suspicious antiquarian in Clockenwell. But I could not yet turn my thoughts away from the hollow corridors and spectral staircases of that crumbling ancestral estate. I have seen many things in my time with Holmes crimes, grotesque and cunning, schemes born from envy or desperation, but what we uncovered in that gray country manor was not merely a mystery. It was a meditation on time, on guilt passed down through generations like a whispered curse, and on how truth, no matter how deeply buried, always seeks the air. What lingered most was not Lord Cedric's face as Holmes handed him the confession, nor even the dismal chamber beneath the stones, but rather Edmund's voice, seacoat in ink and cipher. He had spoken not as a madman, but as a man trying desperately not to become one. Holmes read the newspaper at breakfast as if the entire matter were already fading behind him. The Times made no mention of the Oswalds, nor of any sensational discovery in the North Country. The story, it seemed, had ended in silence. And that, perhaps, was Holmes' design all along. As we shared a quiet tea one evening, I finally asked the question that had gnawed at me since we left Pendelmere. You knew Edmund was alive all along, didn't you? Holmes didn't look up from the paper. I had strong reason to believe so, but you never said it plainly. There was no need. No need. Holmes, the man's father, feared he was dead. Authorities might have launched a formal inquiry. That is precisely what I prevented, Holmes said coolly, folding the paper and setting it down. A formal inquiry would have buried the truth beneath procedural stone. Edmund's disappearance, however theatrical, forced those around him to confront what they would otherwise ignore, which is the cost of a lie maintained for generations. The crime was not murder, Watson. Not in Edmund's time. It was silence. A silence so complete it had become architectural. I leaned back in my chair, watching him. And now, he stirred his tea, then glanced up with that familiar gleam in his eye. Now it echoes no more. I could not help but reflect on that strange woman Lentini Varkand. The haunting way she had said, "He trusted me." She had meant it. I believed her, and I believed that she, more than any of us, understood what Edmund feared. Not the shame of scandal, but the transformation it could spark inside a man. Days later, I received a letter without return address. The paper was thick, the seal nondescript, and the contents spare. Dr. Watson, thank you for walking the corridors of silence. Tell Holmes he was right. There was always a door beneath the echo. E.O. I brought it to Holmes immediately. He read it once, smiled faintly, and slipped it between the pages of a medical almanac on his shelf. He's alive then, I said, clearly, and free of the house. Certainly, Holmes said. Whether he is free of its memory, that remains to be seen. I was about to press him further when Mrs. Hudson arrived with a telegram. Holmes opened it without ceremony, read it silently, and stood. A theft in Belgravia, he said, reaching for his coat. A stolen painting, a missing curator, and a gallery with too many doors. Back to the grind, I said, not without affection. Holmes smiled wryly. The world refuses to remain quiet, Watson. Come, I need your eye. But even as we crossed into the rain-soaked streets, I could not shake the sense that the Pendomere case had changed something fundamental in Holmes. He had always held a curious view of justice, neither bound by statute nor completely apart from it. But this time, he had allowed a man to disappear. He had withheld the truth from the law. He had let a ghost walk free, and in doing so, he had given a voice to the buried. The most remarkable thing, however, was not his handling of the facts, but the restraint with which he had used them. Holmes had solved the mystery long before any of us had pieced it together. The ink, the cipher, the unnatural silence of the house, all of it had spoken to him in a language only he could hear, and yet he had said nothing. Why? Perhaps because Holmes understood something even deeper than guilt or logic, that the truth, when revealed too early, can be as destructive as a lie, that some revelations are only meaningful when earned when the right people are ready to hear them, that silence in the right hands, it's not cowardice, it is precision. Later that week, I returned to Pendomere House on my own. Lord Cedric met me in the same study where our journey had begun. He was thinner, his eyes ringed with shadows, but his voice had softened. I've sealed the catacombs, he said without preamble, not to hide them, but to preserve them. My son's journals are now part of the family archive, properly protected. Will you tell the family? Eventually, he said. When I understand it myself. We stood in silence for a time. Then he added, do you think he'll ever return? I think, I said, he never truly left. That seemed to satisfy him. As I departed, I noticed the portrait of Sir Reginald had been removed from the main corridor. In its place was a mirror. A curious choice, but an appropriate one. Holmes never spoke of the Oswald affair again, except in passing. Once, as we passed through Paddington Station, he remarked, a legacy is not a thing of stone, Watson. It is the shape of memory, and memory may yet be revised. I have recorded this story not because I expect it to be published in my lifetime, but because some truths demand preservation. Holmes always said that the best mysteries are those which reveal as much about the human soul as they do about the crime. Pendomere was such a mystery. It did not teach me about death. It taught me about inheritance and the burden of silence. Certainly, below is Section X, Closing Reflection. One echo more of how Sherlock Holmes changed detective fiction forever. This final chapter offers a contemplative, philosophical closing, true to Doyle's tone where Watson reflects on Holmes' brilliance, the weight of inherited guilt, and the strange satisfaction of a case that ended in silence rather than arrest. It is a curious thing to witness the conclusion of a case that leaves no formal charges, no newspaper headlines, no courtroom drama, only silence, memory, and the shifting air of something altered. And yet I believe Pendelmere may have been one of Sherlock Holmes' most consequential victories, not because he unmasked a murderer or uncovered some vast conspiracy, but because he demonstrated, perhaps more than ever before, the artistry of his restraint. One crisp morning, not long after the events had drawn to a quiet close, I found Holmes standing at our Baker Street window, watching the milk carts roll along the misty edge of Marylebone Road. He did not turn as I entered, though his voice announced, without hesitation, "You've been rereading the journal." Paused, coat still in hand. "How did you?" "Your left sleeve is smudged with charcoal. It's the same variety used in the fireplace at Pendelmere. I also noted that the volume was removed from the second shelf of your room this morning, placed back half an inch to the right." "You've truly no equal," I muttered, sitting. "I've told you before, Watson, the world leaves fingerprints everywhere. It is only a matter of looking closely enough, but not always acting," I said, pointedly. Holmes finally turned. "No, not always." I saw then a quiet resolve behind his eyes of recognition. "Perhaps that power lies as much in omission as in discovery. You let a man vanish," I said. "At another, bear the weight of legacy without correction." "Let a man preserve a truth," Holmes replied, and gave another the burden of what he already knew. Cedric Oswald didn't need public disgrace. He needed perspective, and his son, wherever he may be, needed freedom, not redemption. I said nothing. There was nothing more to challenge. Only questions I already knew Holmes would never answer directly. Later that afternoon, I took a walk through the fog-stitched lanes of Bloomsbury. The streets were as familiar to me as the pages of a well-loved novel. And yet, each one seemed to echo faintly with the memory of that house, the way Pendelmere had revealed itself, not all at once, but in parts, stair by stair, whisper by whisper. That night, I found myself writing. It's not a report for the police or a chapter for any forthcoming publication, but a letter I never intended to send. "Edmund, wherever you are, know this. You were not mad. You were not broken. You did what few men would dare. You walked into the dark, not to destroy your family, but to reveal it, to liberate its name from the tyranny of silence. I do not know if history will remember you, but I will. Yours in respect, Dr. John H. Watson." I folded the letter and placed it into the fireplace, unsealed. It was not meant for post-it, it was meant for smoke. In the weeks that followed, Holmes returned to his usual rhythm. Investigations into jewel thefts, false alibis, and even a matter of industrial espionage involving a baker's union in Lambeth. He never again spoke of the Oswalds, but every so often, I would catch him staring at the fire, not with his usual intensity, but with a distant, unfocused grimace, if searching for something in the flames. "Not a clue, but a memory?" I once asked him during a lulling conversation whether he believed in family curses. He looked at me, bemused. "Curses, Watson, are the inventions of frightened men. But can fear not become real?" I pressed. "Passed down, taught, embedded in the soul." Holmes sipped his tea. "Only if allowed. The truth is far more dangerous than any superstition. A man who lives under the illusion of blood-bound doom may act upon that illusion in doing so. Give the curse form." I nodded slowly. "Then perhaps Edmund feared becoming his own echo. Own echo. A poet's phrase, Holmes mused, but accurate. The man feared himself, and in so doing, fled himself. I dare say, he escaped the family curse, not by proving it false, but by denying it power. He rose, dusted his sleeve, and added dryly, a lesson many in Parliament might do well to learn. It was spring before I heard of Pendomere again. A small notice in the country's chronicle mentioned that Viscount Cedric Oswald had transferred much of his estate to charitable trust and relocated abroad. No scandal, no exile, simply a change, a closing chapter. I clipped the notice and left it on Holmes' desk. When he saw it, he merely remarked, "Ah, so the house exhales at last." And that was the end of it. But Holmes being Holmes, there was still one more echo to ring out. One evening, we were seated by the fire, him with his pipe, I with the latest medical gazette, when he handed me an envelope, plain, sealed, no address, from our vanished friend. I asked. Holmes nodded. Inside was a single card. Upon it, a quote, "He who dares to look beneath the stone must be prepared for what bleeds in the mortar." There was no name, no return address, but affixed to the card was something unmistakably matchstick, bound with a black thread. My breath caught. "It's his mark," I whispered. Holmes leaned back in his chair, smoke rising like incense. "He's watching," he said. "Why send this? To thank us, to remind us, to make sure we never forget that beneath the surface of every noble house lies a buried truth." He tapped the card once and tossed it into the fire. The flames consumed it slowly. We watched it burn without speaking. And so, dear reader, these pages ever find your hands, understand this: Sherlock Holmes did not always seek punishment. He sought understanding. He believed that justice was not always a gallows or a confession, but sometimes a mirror held just long enough for a man to see himself clearly. Pendomere was not just a case. It was a ghost story, told through inheritance and silence. And in solving it, Holmes did not change the law. He changed the legacy. He proved that detective fiction, the stories we tell to make sense of the senseless, can be as much about what we preserve as what we expose. That the true mystery is not always whodunit, but why we hide what we do. And that, I dare say, is how Sherlock Holmes changed detective fiction forever. CHSPTE. 6. It was nearly a year after the Pendomere affair that the ember flickered back to life. I had, by then, put the matter entirely to rest both in memory and in manuscript. Holmes had not uttered the name Oswald in many months, and we had buried ourselves in more tangible intrigues, missing diplomats, counterfeits in Whitechapel, and a peculiar case involving a violinist's disappearance, which Holmes declared utterly pedestrian and refused to pursue further. But on a frigid morning in early November, one of those bleak, metallic days when the London fog hangs low, and Minai received a parcel delivered not by post, but by a child in a navy peacoat. No name, no words, just a nod and the hurried sound of retreating boots before I could even open my mouth. I brought the parcel inside. Holmes was, at the moment, in the midst of dissecting newspaper clippings on a rug-strewn floor, smoking furiously, and mumbling about a banker who had faked his own death to join a religious commune in Dorset. I said nothing. I simply slit open the paper. Inside was a slim, black notebook bound in corded twine and sealed with wax. The seal bore no crest or letters, only a symbol, a small spiral inked in red dot. My breath caught. Holmes looked up at once. "What is it?" "Watson." I handed it over, silently. His long fingers broke the seal with ease. He flipped through the first few pages, and then stilled. "It's him," he said. "Edmund." Holmes nodded once, without question. He continued reading, the lines of his face tightening with a kind of academic fascination that often preceded something terrible. I waited. Finally, he handed me the open notebook. "Start here." he said. The page was dated only Lake Nemi. 2 months ago. The voices are not gone. They echo in the stone and in the river and in the wind against the olive trees. I left Pendlemere, but Pendlemere did not leave me. I do not write this to unburden, but to warn. The legacy I unearthed has branches, roots that extend beyond the house sent to others like it. Families who wrote silence into their histories and dared call it honor. Holmes folded his arms. He's not done, Watson. Not in the least. You believe he's investigating again? I believe, Holmes said. He's begun something he cannot stop. And I believe someone wants us to know. He flipped to the final page of the book. There was only a single line written in an angular hand. The man who vanished beneath. The stone will speak again, but not in England. Holmes stood abruptly. Get your coat? Where are we going? To the Royal Historical Society archives, he said. Already halfway to the door. I want to know who last accessed their ledger on the Oswald family's colonial holdings in Liguria. Liguria, that's in Italy. Indeed, Holmes said, teeth gleaming. And what else is in Italy? Lake Nemi. That evening, I returned home hours after Holmes, my boots soaked, my mind racing. He had left a note on my writing desk. Watson B. Packed by morning. The trail leads to Rome. There's something rotten beneath the marble. She sat in the firelight for a long while, the black notebook resting beside my untouched tea. It felt not like the return of a case, but the continuation of one we had merely paused. The Oswalds were never just one family. They were the symbol of something larger, something systemic. Old wealth, old secrets, carefully pruned branches of history, and Edmund, wherever he was, had clearly stumbled onto its broader shape. We departed for Rome under a false name. 2 days later, it would not be the first time Holmes worked beneath layers of disguise, but this time there was a nervous energy in him that unsettled me, as if he were hunting something older than crime, something built into the stone of task, civilization itself. Do you believe Edmund's in danger? I asked as we crossed the channel. Holmes said nothing for some time. Then, he's beyond danger. He's in the marrow now. It's too deep to resurface clean. The next few days unfolded in silence as we arrived in Italy. Holmes reading the notebook obsessively, muttering about familial cartography and intergenerational complicity. We eventually traced the ink-stained breadcrumbs to an old villa perched above Lake Nemi, long abandoned and recently sold to a society of historians. Locals called it La Casa del Silenzio, the House of Silence, a name that chilled me to the bone. We stood at its rustic gates under moonlight. Holmes turned to me with a look both exhilarated and grim. This, he said, is not a new mystery. It is the oldest one. Come, Watson, we have echoes to follow. And thus, dear reader, the story of Pendlemere did not truly end in the catacombs beneath the Oswald estate. It passed like a torch hand to hand, voice to voice, through time and across borders. Edmund Oswald may have escaped the legacy of silence in one house, but he had stepped into something vaster, something deeper, a tapestry of half-buried truths sewn into the very history of the families who built the empire. And once again, Sherlock Holmes, the master of detail, of shadow, of the hidden note in the forgotten corner, was at its center. There was no blood yet, no crime scene, no confession, only a whisper, only the start, only one echo more. The villa perched above Lake Nemi was no longer marked on any official maps. Its name, La Casa del Silenzio, existed now only in oral traditions whispered by vineyard workers and murmured by local priests. The townsfolk we encountered refused to speak of it with any clarity, as though afraid to invoke a thing long thought buried. But Holmes had a map. Not one printed on paper, but the more elusive one that lived behind his eyes, formed from history, intuition, and quiet obsession. The villa belonged once to the Farnese family, he said as we stood before the gates, rusted and overgrown, later occupied by minor nobility. It's connected to the British consulate in Genoa, but the title was transferred in the late 19th century to a private English interest connected to the Oswalds. I asked. Holmes tapped his cane once on the stone. More than connected. I believe this was their Mediterranean retreat, a place for business and for concealment. The iron creaked as we pushed our way through. The grounds were vast, overgrown with wild rosemary and ivy that twisted like veins along the statues and sundials. The main house rose 3 stories in faded yellow stone, its shutters ajar and its windows empty. Inside, the air was thick with disuse. Dust floated like ash in columns of sunlight. The floorboards creaked with the sound of abandonment, and yet did not feel uninhabited. Holmes led with his lantern in hand, eyes flicking from the torn wallpaper to the charred remnants of furniture. He paused at a grand staircase. Its banister snapped in two. Do you smell it? He asked suddenly. Smell what? Chuck, he said, and something else betrayed, perhaps. This house was searched, not by looters, by someone looking for something precise. We explored for hours, the villa offered. Up little, beyond ruin now. We found the mirror room. It was on the 2nd floor, past a cracked hallway and behind a door with a faded fresco of Icarus. The room itself was lined with mirrors, floor to ceiling, all nailed in place. At first, I thought it an eccentricity, perhaps the whim of a former owner. But Holmes stood still in the center and said, "This is an archive." He pointed to the mirrored wall before him. "Help me shift it." He pried at the seam, and after several grunts and groans, the mirror gave way to reveal a cavity in the wall, narrow, dusty, and lined with wooden drawers. Inside were folders, wrapped in oilskin, documents bound in ribbon, and an object I did not expect, a child's toy soldier, fashioned from bronze. Holmes turned it over in his hand. Symbolic, I asked. He nodded. Likely a cipher marker or a token of guilt. He unrolled one of the oilskin bundles. Side were ledgers handwritten and spidery. They kept records, Holmes murmured. Not just Oswald Holdings. Look at this. Roughly, Marchmont. Winstonley, British families with connections to colonial enterprises in North Africa and the East Indies, all tied to land swaps and banking movements between 1858 and 1872. I felt a cold knot form in my gut. You believe the Oswald scandal, what we saw at Pendelmare's? Just one branch of something far larger. Holmes nodded. Yes, a curated silence that spans across oceans. Its profits laundered through aristocratic titles. Madness hidden behind linen and marble. He held up one page. Listen to this. Payment to W.R. authorized via Venetian intermediary. Ensure he is relocated to Genoa before St. Mark's Day. That's code, not just finance. This was the system. Before I could reply, sound footsteps echoed from below. Holmes raised a finger. We moved silently down the stairs, hearts hammering. The front door creaked again, but this time closed. Holmes stepped toward the foyer. No one was there, but on the table in the entry hall was a note pinned beneath a glass marble. You are too early, but not unwelcome. EOI looked at Holmes, startled. He's here, or was, likely just now. Holmes's tone was not surprise, but something closer to concern. He picked up the marble and held it to the light. Watson, do you recall the cipher used at Pendelmere? The spiral drawn with wax. Yes, this marble is etched with the same design beneath the surface. See? I squinted. Indeed, a faint spiral coiled within the glass like a sleeping serpent. Then he's tracking us, I said. Or guiding us, Holmes murmured. We remained in the villa that night, lodging in a side wing Holmes deemed structurally sound. He refused to sleep, instead continuing to sift through documents and cross-reference surnames in his pocket notebook. I dozed near dawn, but awoke to find Holmes seated at the edge of the terrace, watching the sun rise over the still lake. "Did you rest at all?" I asked. "No. Did you find anything?" "Enough," he said quietly. "Enough to see the shape of it. This is no longer about Edmund alone." He turned to me. "There is a network, Watson. One built on concealment, not wealth. Society not unlike the Diogenes Club, but older. Possibly political. Possibly worse. And you think Edmund intends to bring it down?" Holmes looked out across the lake again. "I think he is trying to finish what his ancestors could not admit began." As we departed the villa the next day, we passed a chapel carved into the hillside. Faded Latin inscriptions adorned the stone. Holmes paused there, noting a freshly placed candle in the alcove. "A sign," he said. "We are on the right path. And what's next?" He smiled faintly. "Venice. Why there?" He handed me a single sheet of parchment tucked into one of the villa's drawers. On it was written, "There are doors beneath the basilica. One leads to the archive, another to the grave." I swallowed. "Do you suppose that's literal?" "With Edmund Oswald," Holmes said, "everything is both metaphor and map." CSPD 07. We arrived in Venice under a lowering sky. The train from Rome had crawled its way up the peninsula like a dying serpent. And by the time we stepped onto the stone of Santa Lucia station, the Grand Canal was cloaked in fog so thick it seemed to rise from the water like the breath of ghosts. The gondoliers moved like shadows through pale vapor, and the familiar bell of San Marco echoed across the lagoon with an almost funereal note. "Charming," Holmes muttered as he adjusted his collar. "A city designed for secrets." It was my first time in Venice, and despite the tension of our errand, I could not help but be taken in by the air of melancholy elegance palazzos decaying with dignity, stone lions crouching atop arches like sentinels of a forgotten age. But Holmes had no time for wonder. He led me briskly through a labyrinth of narrow kale, down twisting alleys that reeked of salt and mildew, until we arrived at a modest boarding house near Campo San Barnaba. Our lodgings were unremarkable, save for the fact that our room faced the side chapel of the Basilica di San Marco, the very place the parchment had alluded to. "There are doors beneath the basilica," I said, recalling Edmund's cryptic line. "But that structure has stood since the 11th century. There must be dozens of subterranean chambers." "Precisely," Holmes said, setting down his valise. "Which is why we need an entry point, something less liturgical." That evening, under the pretense of academic curiosity, Holmes arranged a private tour of the basilica's archives through a contact at the Museo Cor. The official reason, key to be researching historical ties between English noble families and Venetian trade dynasties. The curator, Signor Bortoluzzi, was delighted by the ruse. The basilica itself was closed to the public by the time we arrived, its interior lit only by oil lanterns placed by the custodian. Shadows danced along the gilded mosaics. Christ, apostles, winged beasts all looked down upon us with expressionless solemnity. We were led to a side chapel, the Capella's Inn, where Holmes lingered as the tour continued into the archives proper. "This," he whispered when we were momentarily alone, "is our point of ingress." He pointed toward a trapdoor barely visible behind a decorative altar. Its hinges bore signs of recent use, despite being marked inaccessible. We returned after midnight, cloaked and silent. Holmes had procured a replica key from a locksmith in Cannaregio earlier that afternoon. I did not see, but did not question, as the basilica lay in slumber beneath the moon. We descended into its underbelly. The passageway was narrow and oppressive, the stone walls slick with centuries of condensation. At first, it seemed to lead only to a wine cellar of sorts, abandoned and dusty. But Holmes pressed on, his lantern held low. "There," he said at last, pointing to a faint seam in the stone. "Help me shift it." We pried loose a section of the wall, revealing a hidden archway. Beyond it, the air changed. It grew colder, metallic, and then we found it. A chamber beneath the basilica, carved in rough symmetry, with columns flanking a raised dais. At its center stood a lectern, holding a ledger. Beside it, a chair. Kent, in the chair a man. He did not move. We approached slowly. Holmes first. He's dead, Holmes whispered after a pause. Days, at most. No wounds, no signs of struggle. The man was perhaps in his 60s, well dressed in the style of English nobility. In his gloved hands, he held a rosary. On his lapel pinned with deliberate care was a crest, a coiled spiral. Holmes removed a letter from the corpse's breast pocket. The envelope was addressed only with a simple dot inside, a single page. You came too late, or perhaps just in time. The ledger will tell you what I cannot. I was not the first. Beneath the signature was one initial, W. Not Edmund, I murmured. No, Holmes said grimly. But one of them. We examined the ledger in silence. Its pages were dense, coded in what appeared to be a mix of Venetian dialect and Latin, but Holmes quickly discerned a pattern. Names, transfers, holdings. Look here. R. Oswald to initiate 4. Basilica patronage, minus 1,861. And here, host, held in Venice until Reformation complete. What does it mean? Asked. Holmes closed the book slowly. This means the Oswald affair is merely one node of a hidden society operating for over a century, possibly longer, tied to sacred sites, nobility, money, but more than that, inheritance, roles passed down like titles, secrets preserved like relics, and Edmund's place in it. He was meant to inherit silence, Holmes said. Instead, he chose to expose it. We left the basilica just before dawn, emerging into a Venice shrouded in mist. The bell rang 6 times as we crossed the Ponte dei Sospiri, the Bridge of Sighs. Apt, Holmes muttered, the last breath of the condemned. Back at the boarding house, we took stock. The dead man, W, had no identification beyond the crest and note. Holmes sent a discreet telegram to Mycroft requesting confirmation on potential diplomatic deaths. If this society was truly interwoven with the upper echelons, Mycroft would know. But even Holmes seemed uncharacteristically unsure. I can follow facts, he said that morning. But this is myth-made ledger. What we found is not one crime, but a structural design passed down through generation in ruin. Do you think Edmund is watching us? Holmes did not reply at once. Instead, he reached into his coat and removed a small card delivered to our room while we were out. He handed it to me. There are 2 keys. One lies with the dead, the other with the keeper of ink and salt. E. I read it twice. Ink and salt. Paper and blood, Holmes said, or a library near the sea. I suspect Trieste. And what are the keys for? Holmes lit his pipe, staring out over the Grand Canal, to open the part of history no one dares record. The Adriatic glistened like steel beneath the leaden sky as we stepped off the ferry at Trieste's Porto Vecchio. The air was sharp with salt and smoke, and the city's skyline rose before us like a fortress of rusted stone and silent spires. It was, Holmes remarked, a place where Europe ends by forgetting itself. Trieste was a city of thresholds, part Austro-Hungarian in bone, Italian in blood, and Balkan in mood. A place where empires had once passed hands like worn currency, where power hid not in palaces but in warehouses and bookshops and attics. It was, in other words, precisely the sort of place where a secret could be kept for generations. Holmes had said the phrase, keeper of ink and salt, could imply either a writer bound to the sea or a scribe buried in bureaucracy. We suspected the latter. By mid-morning, We had taken rooms at the Pensione Orso Bianco, overlooking the Piazza Unita d'Italia. Holmes wasted no time. Within the hour, we were walking up the hill toward the Biblioteca Civica Attilio Hortus Trieste's oldest public archive, named after a man who once cataloged the secrets of the empire with unsettling precision. The library was an austere, Romanesque structure, all quiet arches and pale marble, its vaulted ceilings humming with the scent of aged vellum and damp ink. Inside, the silence was cathedralic. A gaunt man in a double-breasted coat stood behind the main desk, spectacles perched on the end of his long nose. His name, we learned, was Tomasz Baranek, and he had been the chief archivist for over 30 years. Holmes introduced himself as a historical researcher from the University of Edinburgh, studying the movements of British consular families in pre-unification Italy. Baranek was instantly intrigued. "You are not the first Englishman to come looking for records on such things," he said, leading us into a rear wing of the library filled with sealed cabinets and wheeled ladders. The last was ... peculiar. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "May I ask when this peculiar visitor arrived?" Baranek tapped his chin. 6 months past, perhaps 7. He did not give his real name, but he asked for records on 3 families, Walswald, Grenville, and Winston Lee. My heart quickened. Holmes merely nodded. Did he find what he sought? Baranek shook his head. Not entirely, but he left a donation substantial enough to grant him access to our ... less public collections. Private donations often have very specific goals, Holmes said mildly. Baranek's eyes narrowed behind his spectacles, as do the men who make them. He led us into a deeper chamber. One, I later learned, was once part of a Jesuit crypt. Here the walls sweated, and the air hung thick with mildew. A single case stood at the far end of the room, cleeked and marked Raccolta Privata, 1871. Baranek opened it with a small iron key. Inside were 2 volumes bound in crimson leather. These were cataloged by a man named Gruber in the 1880s, Baranek said. He died mad. Claimed the books whispered to him. Holmes said nothing. He was already reading. The first volume contained shipping manifest ledgers from British merchant ships entering the Gulf of Trieste between 1859 and 1867. Names and cargo, the usual. But the second volume was different. It was a list not of goods, but of people. Each name paired with a numerical designation and what appeared to be a location code. Holmes turned to a page marked with a red ribbon. There, near the center of the page, EO, Initiate Class V, filed. Inchiostro, E, Cell Location 44B. Holmes exhaled softly. Ink and salt, he murmured. He was here, and left something behind. Baranek leaned in. That code 44B's not part of our system, then it's part of someone else's. Holmes insisted we remain in the library until dusk, scouring indexes, margin notes, and the archive's donation registry. Finally, through a series of faded records and coded references, he located a directory written in Latin and ciphered initials. It led us to a subterranean vault, originally a storage cellar beneath the library's foundation. Long sealed after flooding in 1892, we returned with Baranek after hours. The man, clearly wary, allowed Holmes to unseal the cellar, provided we swore to take nothing without cataloging it. Holmes agreed, though. I noticed his fingers twitch slightly as he pocketed his magnifying lens. Down below, the stone stairs descended into darkness, and the smell of brine hit us like a blow. Salt, Holmes said. The sea flooded, and one scent left a signature. The room we entered was more cavern than Cellerit's shelves, swollen and warped from water damage. Its stone archways dotted with barnacle scars, and in the very center, sitting atop a plinth, was a sealed box of green tin, no larger than a shoebox. marked only with the spiral symbol and the number 44B. Holmes approached it reverently. "This is it." Berenice stepped back. "I do not wish to be here when it is opened." "Understood," Holmes said. The archivist disappeared quickly, the door echoing behind him. Holmes unlatched the box with his usual deftness. Inside were several items. A sealed letter, addressed to those who walk backwards through blood. A bronze coin, unlike any currency I had seen, bearing no monarch. Only the same spiral. A thin journal, handwritten in a spare, precise hand. Holmes opened the journal first. "This is not confession. This is inventory." So the first line read. We read for nearly 2 hours by lantern light. The journal was meticulous account names, locations, fund transfers, and rituals. It detailed how the Oswalds and others like them maintained secrecy through maritime routes, libraries, and foreign consulates. What chilled me most was a passage dated 1865. "Those who do not inherit obedience must be made to inherit silence. Bloodlines matter less than complicity. If they refuse, they vanish, and still the system endures." Holmes turned the final page and held up a separate sheet tucked in the back. It was a map, not of Trieste, but of Istanbul. "There," he said, tapping a marked symbol near the Bosphorus. "The final key." We sealed the box once more. Holmes left a meticulous note for Berenice, detailing the condition of the vault and the chain of access as we stepped back out into the night air of Trieste. I asked, "Do you think Edmund placed this for us? Or for someone else?" Holmes lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. "I think," he said slowly, "that he left it because he knew someone had to survive the story." Istanbul was unlike any city I had ever seen. It did not hum, as London did, nor whisper, as Venice had. Instead, it breathes lowly, thickly, like a living organism, older than empire, older than doctrine. Every stone was etched with ghosts, every alleyway bent under the weight of centuries, and every conversation, even the mundane, carried the quiet cadence of secrets. We arrived in the shadow of the Hagia Sophia, the muezzin's call reverberating like a ripple through the tiled domes and sun-drenched minarets. Holmes, as always, walked without hesitation, while others navigated the city through maps or language. Holmes moved by architecture, by rhythm, by the faint trail of ink and blood, left in the margins of history. The map from Trieste had directed us not to a palace, nor an embassy, but to a far humbler destination, a closed hammam bathhouse on the edge of the Ballot district near the water's edge. It was called Beit al-Samta, House of Silence. Name, it seemed, that followed us like a refrain, built by Genoese merchants in the 15th century. Holmes said, scanning the facade, then taken by Ottoman nobles, and eventually by families who needed a vault for their ghosts. We entered just before dusk. The bathhouse was long abandoned, its wooden doors warped and salt-bitten, its windows boarded. The copper dome sat, cracked above the central chamber. We stepped inside, the echo of our footfalls swallowed by the vast stillness. At the heart of the marble floor was a drain, shaped like a spiral. Holmes knelt and pressed his palm to it. "Help me lift," he said. The stone cover gave way, slowly revealing a dark shaft descending into the bowels of the city. I hesitated. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "this is where it ends." The passage was narrow and damp, the walls slick with condensation and old soot. After 10 minutes, we emerged into a vaulted chamber beneath the bathhouse circular, lined with alcoves carved into the walls. At its center stood a table bearing 3 items: a lantern, a sealed envelope, and a familiar bronze coin. Holmes took the envelope first. It bore no seal, only a word written in Latin: refutatio, refusal. Holmes translated, eyes narrowing. He opened it and read silently, for some time, then handed it to me. If you are reading this, then I failed, or perhaps I succeeded in a manner that does not bear survival. There are names I could not publish, truths I could not utter. Even I, who stood at the brink, stepped back. The system was not one conspiracy, but a network of necessity, built to ensure that power flowed clean in public hand, rotted quietly. In private, the question, Mr. Holmes, is not whether you can stop it. The question is whether you should. Edmund Oswald looked up. He knew we'd come. He knew someone would. Holmes said softly. He didn't write this as a warning. He wrote it as a choice. He turned his attention to the coin. On the reverse side, a new inscription had been etched, to vanish or to refuse. What does it mean? I asked. Holmes's face was unreadable. It means the game is over. I watched as he reached into his coat and withdrew a matchbox. Then, without ceremony, he struck the match and lit the parchment on the table, followed by the coin and the lantern wick. The flames rose slowly, eating away the last traces of Edmund's legacy. Holmes, I cried. What are you doing? I'm ending it, he said, voice low. This entire network survives, not through law or strength, but through memory, through the preservation of shadows. If we catalog it, we legitimize it. If we expose it, we risk turning it into spectacle. But we came all this way, not to publish, Watson, to bury. The fire consumed the last of the letter. Holmes stepped back and placed the stone lid over the flame. We are not saviors, he said. We are custodians. And sometimes the only justice is to ensure silence is no longer weaponized. We emerged from the hammam just as the call to evening prayer drifted over the rooftops. Holmes said nothing on the return to our hotel. That night, he did not touch his pipe, nor did he read. He sat at the window, gazing out at the Bosporus, his silhouette etched in moonlight in the morning. He handed me a single page torn from his notebook. This is not a story I will ever solve, Watson, nor one I should. The Oswald affair began with a whisper and nearly ended with a scream. But it is not ours to shout. Let this remain a footnote. Let it vanish as those who refused often must. You may write it, but write it as a parable, not a fact. Write it as a mirror, not a map. Let them puzzle. Let them guess, but never let them follow. I folded the note and said nothing. For once, I did not feel the need to argue. It was many years later, after the war. After Holmes had retired to Sussex, that I finally opened my journal again to write of the case we never solved. I wrote, not as a doctor, nor a chronicler of adventures, but as a man who had stood too long in the room of a vanished truth. I changed the names, obscured the cities. I buried the coin in a private drawer I never opened again, and I titled the manuscript simply, How Sherlock Holmes Changed Detective Fiction Forever, because, in the end, that was the truth that mattered, not the conspiracies, not the bloodlines, but the man who showed us that mystery is not always meant to be solved. Sometimes it is meant to be understood, and sometimes left behind.